that the whole scheme of Prussian elementary education is shaped with the express purpose of making 95 out of every 100 citizens subservient to the ruling house and to the state. Hey, what's going on, guys? I have mentioned in past videos on how the government will use propaganda, very biased or misleading information, to convince the populace to do something they otherwise would think is a very bad idea. Whether it be in the media or Hollywood, through techniques they learned from scientists brought over from Nazi Germany for Operation Paperclip, or it be through techniques of their own they've learned and used through Operation Mockingbird, for most people they are introduced to misleading or completely incorrect information before they are even old enough to pay attention to the news or movies. I have mentioned in previous videos how college campuses are full of this communist, globalist, identity politics, politically correct, victim mentality, mumbo jumbo, garbage, bullshit. But this is nothing new. Our school system is entirely based upon the Prussia model. We have all seen time and time again how our so-called leaders, or better yet our shepherds, will do anything and everything in their power to make us meek, docile, and obedient. Just like when Bill Gates said we should be more like China when dealing with the pandemic, who was known for welding citizens' doors closed just to get through the quarantine, where most of the people didn't survive. So this is what our leaders, or the people who are most influential on our leaders, are essentially telling us we need to be more like. But for us to understand how most of this started, and how it starts with most of us throughout our lives in the school system, when most of us are too young to even think for ourselves, they are doing their best to mold our minds in the image they see fit. So before I get any further into explaining how this begins with the school system, I would just like to read you a short little article about what the Prussia model is, how our school systems were before everything we see today, who started it, and why they started it. And I'm sorry, I usually try to do as little reading as possible. I mean, I do a lot of reading in the research for a lot of these videos, but for me to really kind of drive this point home, for us to understand how deep most of the brainwashing and manipulating, where it comes from, and how far it's come in the past 200 years, that this has not been happening overnight. This is nothing new. This didn't start recently. This has been a very long, planned out process. And it will make a lot of sense by the end of the video on where we see our world and our society today. Perhaps one of the most concise descriptions of how the 19th century Prussian schooling system became a model for American schools can be found in the Wikipedia entry "Emulation of the Prussian Education System in the United States." American educators were fascinated by German educational trends. In 1818, John Griscom gave a favorable report of Prussian education. English translations were made of French philosopher Victor Cousin's work, Report on the State of Public Education in Prussia. Calvin E. Stowe, Henry Bernard, Horace Mann, we'll be talking about him a lot in this, George Bancroft, and Joseph Cogswell all had vigorous interest in German education. In 1843, Mann traveled to Germany to investigate how the educational process worked. Upon his return to the United States, he lobbied heavily to have the Prussian model adopted. Now, I've mentioned, of course, a lot in my videos how our school system is full of propaganda. Our media is full of propaganda. Hollywood, social media, all of this. But this will show where it started, and once you see where this comes from, and I'm learning a lot of this along with you, and how we see how our government has taken so much, not just how I showed in the last video talking about how NASA was founded by Nazis. It turns out that most of our school system was founded by the precursor to what Nazis became. So propaganda is nothing new, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down anytime soon. Man convinced his fellow modernizers, especially those in the Whig Party, to legislate tax-supported elementary public education in their states. Indeed, most northern states adopted one version or another of the system he established in Massachusetts, especially the program for, quote, normal schools to train professional teachers. In 1852, Mann was instrumental in the decision to adopt the Prussian education system in Massachusetts. Soon, New York State set up the same method in 12 different schools on a trial basis. This system was characterized by compulsory attendance, teacher colleges, standardized national tests, national age-graded curriculum, compulsory kindergarten, the fragmenting of concepts into separate subjects with fixed periods of study, and the state ultimately asserting a superior claim to the child over the rights of the parents. This was a radical departure of the methodology and content from the successful traditional forms of American education. Most people have no idea how the modern school systems evolved. Some may think that compulsory public schools grew organically from the bottom up, with parents demanding tax-supported public schools to be established for the good of their children and the nation. However, that is not the case. Early American education from 1776 through the early decades of the 19th century could be characterized as being decentralized, entrepreneurial, and driven by the demands of individual parents and local communities, not school districts or states. Some form of education was a universal aspect of the lives of the majority of children by the early part of the 19th century, long before the state compulsory attendance laws were enacted and public schools were the norm. In Free to Learn, Boston College psychologist Peter Gray describes the educational environment in Europe and America at the time. By the beginning of the 19th century, churches throughout Europe had been forced out of political power, and the states began to take over the task of educating the young. The primary purpose of the new state-run schools was not literacy. By this time in history, the written word was everywhere, and literacy was high throughout Europe and North America. Children whose parents could read learned quite easily to read at home. The primary educational concern of leaders in government and industry was not to make people literate, but to gain control over what people read, what they thought, and how they behaved. Secular leaders in education promoted the idea that state-controlled schools, and if the children were required by law to attend those schools, then the state could shape each new generation of citizens into ideal patriots and workers. Educator John Taylor Gatto, in The Underground History of American Education, describes the Prussian thinking at the time. The Prussian mind, which carried the day, had a clear idea of what centralized schooling should deliver: obedient soldiers to the army, obedient workers for the mines, factories, and farms, well-subordinated civil servants, trained in their function, well-subordinated clerks for the industry, citizens who thought alike on most issues, national uniformity in thought, word, and deed. The area of individual violation for commoners was severely foreclosed by Prussian psychological training, procedures drawn from the experience of animal husbandry and equestrian training, and also taken from past military experience. And we see this a lot happening today, and it's only going to be getting worse. That the individual is dying, and they want us to be a hive mind. That is what communism is all about. So whatever kind of talking head might be on the news or some kind of talk show that is telling us that we would all be better if we were all communist, it's good for the average person. Sure, if we were in a colony, if we were in a town of 2,000, a communist system would be best. We all play our part, we all work together, nobody is lazy, we are as strong as the weakest link in the chain. When we are a country over 300 million people, and the people on top are already taking more than their fair share, communism wouldn't apply to them. Communism would not apply to the banks that get a bailout anytime they make a mistake, but get to keep the profits whenever things are going well. What we already have is a socialist economy, but it is not good for me and you. It is only good for the ultra-elite rich, for the ultra-elite wealthy, like-minded individuals that do what they can to lead us to our own destruction, that get all of us to bicker over color, over race, over culture, over things that do not matter, because the average person has way more alike and in common than the people in charge telling us what we should and should not think, what we should and should not read, what we should and should not pay attention to on things like YouTube. We believe, however, that a careful study of the Prussian school system will convince any unbiased reader that the Prussian citizen cannot be free to do and act for himself, that the Prussian is to do a large measure enslaved through the medium of his school and his learning, instead of making him his own master, forges the chain by which he is held in servitude, that the whole scheme of Prussian elementary education is shaped with the express purpose of making 95 out of every 100 citizens subservient to the ruling house and to the state. Now that's just kind of a brief breakdown of what we saw and what their thinking was at the time. And the main person that made all of this come to fruition and that saw so much hope in this was Horace Man. Now luckily I already found a video, so I don't have to do all of the work in this entire presentation, but I want to show you a brief kind of synopsis of who he was and why he put so much work into making all of us not individuals, but all of us just brainless, subservient factory workers that will only be obedient and no longer ask questions. Take a look at this.
And now we come to the great man himself, a man history records as being instrumental in the creation of America's public education system. Horace Mann was an American educator who served as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, part of the American Congress. Horace Mann was the key reformer of the education system at the time. In 1837, he became the head of the newly created Board of Education in Massachusetts, where he began the work that would eventually earn him the title as the Father of American Public Education. After reading through the educational models of different countries, Mann finally hears about a particularly successful style that had been developed in Prussia, which is now modern-day Germany. The Prussian system had shown to be such a success for the government's purposes that, accompanied by a few other educators, Horace Mann travels to Germany to investigate. Upon their return to the United States, they lobbied heavily to have the Prussian model adopted.
All in favor, say aye.
Interest in Prussia had also been growing in the northern half of the continent. Around this time, the Canadian Superintendent of Schools, Egerton Ryerson, traveled to Prussia in search of a new model of education. His journeys also included visiting Horace Mann in Massachusetts to further examine the system he would eventually adopt. George Brown, the editor of Toronto's Globe newspaper, was even quoted saying that Ryerson had successfully imported Prussian education into Ontario. During the next 30 years or so, a whole line of American dignitaries came to Germany to earn degrees. Interestingly enough, those who earned degrees in Germany came back to the United States to staff all the major universities. By 1900, all the PhDs in the United States were trained in Prussia. As the first secretary of the State Board of Education, Horace Mann promoted his new concept that the state is the father of children. He stressed that it was the responsibility of the state to ensure that education was provided for the child. A very noble idea, of course, but what exactly did he mean by that? And how did he define education? It seems like a very broad subject. It is a very broad subject. Education encompasses all of human history and all the knowledge we have gathered during that time. Not to mention, and perhaps most importantly, what we as human beings learn over our lifetime on a personal level. Horace Mann's 10th annual report in 1846 led to the first state law that made it mandatory for children to go to school. It was during that year that he supported the governor of Massachusetts in adopting the Prussian model of education for the entire state. How did he do that? The governor of the time, Edward Everett, as it turns out, was the very first to receive a PhD from, can you guess where? That's right, Prussia. From then on, it spread very quickly. Just after Everett installed the Prussian model in the state of Massachusetts, the governor of New York set up the very same method in 12 New York schools. Horace Mann's sister, Elizabeth Peabody, of the Peabody Foundation, saw to it that right after the Civil War, the Prussian system that was then being taught in the northern states was integrated into the conquered South. By 1900, most of the compulsory schooling laws that implemented the new system had been passed. From then on, every American child grew up under the Prussian system. So what exactly was the Prussian education system that everyone thought was so amazing that it just had to be adopted throughout the free world? To give you just a bit of background, in the 18th century, the Kingdom of Prussia, which is now modern-day Germany, was among the first countries of the world to introduce free and compulsory education. After the Prussians were defeated by Napoleon in 1806, it was decided that the reason why the battle was lost was that the Prussian soldiers were thinking for themselves in the battlefield instead of following orders. To make sure that this couldn't happen again, a new 8-year system of schooling was created. This new system provided not only the skills needed for the early industrialized world, such as reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also a strict education that taught duty, discipline, respect for authority, and the ability to follow orders. Elite children destined for higher offices went on to attend private schools, while the rest of the population had no access to the secondary education. They were destined for the working class. Through this new system, the Prussian court tried to create social obedience in the citizens through indoctrination. Every individual had to become convinced at the core of their being that the king was just, his decisions were always right, and the need for obedience paramount. In truth, the entire purpose of the system was to instill loyalty to the crown and to train young men for the military and bureaucracy. To do this, it was necessary to squeeze out all independent thinking from the masses. Influencing this new system from the beginning was Prussian philosopher Johann Gottlieb Fichte. Combining John Locke's view that the children are a blank slate and Rousseau's ideas on how to write on that slate, Prussia established an educational system that was considered scientific in nature. An important part of the Prussian system was that it defined for the child what was to be learned, what was to be thought about, and how long to think about it. In order to have an efficient policy-making class and a subclass beneath it, it was believed that one had to remove the power of most people to make sense out of the available information. In other words, critical thinking had to be done away with. Now, if you're wondering why the average person doesn't know that the North American education system is based directly on the Prussian model, it might just be because its original purpose was not designed for the good of the individual, but for the good of the government. The philosophy of Johann Fichte directly influenced the creation of the Prussian model of schooling, as he is quoted saying, "The schools must fashion the person, and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will." With quotes like these, you can see why his involvement is not well known. Education should aim at destroying free will, so that after pupils are thus schooled, they will be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than as their schoolmasters would have wished. When this technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. In 1807, in a Berlin occupied by Napoleon, Johann Fichte gave a series of famous addresses to the German nation. Fichte spoke of the superiority of German people above all others. The content of these speeches was a catalyst for the Prussian education system and German nationalism. In other earlier works, he calls Jews a state within a state that would, quote, undermine the German nation. He openly expressed a desire to expel Jews from Germany. Fichte had a deep influence on the rise of the Third Reich, and continues to be deemed, quote, the spiritual father of modern neo-Nazism. Which begs the question, why would the father of American education make it a law that every child spend their youth in a system created by the father of neo-Nazism? Historians reflect that one of the greatest social factors that allowed a man like Hitler to rise to power was that the German people had been bred from birth to respect authority above all else and accept it without question. Which begs another question. If the entire population of North America is raised in a system adopted from pre-Nazi Germany, what are we setting ourselves up for?
So you would think with all of this effort being put into making our schools so uniform from state to state, that all of us being taught the exact same thing, that it must be so important that our schools should be top-notch, with the billions of dollars going into the education system in this country alone, which comes out to about $12,000 per student per year on average. That when we have politicians or people in power like Kamala Harris, who threatens the single parent a $2,000 fine or up to a year in jail if their child misses more than 10 days of unexcused absences, you would think that all of this would be a result or evidence of our school system being top-notch and there being no room for improvement. But this doesn't seem to be the case. With this government-mandated curriculum being taught at the ages where our minds are most malleable and we are most impressionable, it varying from state to state, averaging around from 6 years old to 18 years old, when we are most receptive to information and most trusting in the people who are telling us that information. This is where we must be most aware. They are not trying to produce the most intelligent citizens. They're not trying to produce people who ask questions, who are self-aware, who are aware of the falsehoods around them. We go into this factory known as school, where we go from place to place whenever the bell deems it necessary. That we are the product, and the factory is producing a product, and they want this product to be as uniform and identical as possible. There is no individuality in the government-mandated Prussian school system. This is where we need to be aware that we need to be educating our children ourselves. We need to be educating ourselves. They are nothing more than a glorified babysitter. And especially with Kamala Harris laughing about the fact that she might be throwing these single parents in jail.
I would not be standing here were it not for the education I received. And I know many of us will say the same thing. And I believe a child going without an education is tantamount to a crime. So I decided I was going to start prosecuting parents for truancy. Well, this was a little controversial in San Francisco.
Or the fact that she wants to increase the school year from 6 or 8 hours to 10.
Well, Kamala Harris, she's the California senator we were all supposed to think was going to be the next president. Oh, absolutely, she's perfect. She doesn't have any children of her own, but she's got big plans for your children. Harris has proposed a bill that would extend school hours nationally to 6 p.m. Now, the idea is to align the school day with the work day, and that, of course, would make it easier, this is the key, for parents to serve shareholders by staying late at the office. So while you're plugging numbers into Excel spreadsheets in some soulless glass office building in preparation for the next quarterly report, the state will raise your children.
The fact that she is our future vice president, we must be even more aware today than ever that us educating ourselves, us educating our children or our communities and working together because we are on our own. We are not on our own to where we are alone as individuals. We are on our own to where we cannot trust the government, we cannot trust Hollywood, we cannot trust the media, we cannot trust the school system. And for anybody out there who might be thinking, well, that was then, this is now, times have changed, things have only improved. You're talking about a school system that was founded 200 years ago. Well, I would like to show you a few articles from very recently, how the propaganda in college campuses has only gotten worse, where the students are now yelling at the teachers, and I'm sure most people have heard about this, that any white teachers, that they are just an act of privilege. Just with our school system being based on the same propaganda that got Hitler to where he was when he rose to power, is the same way our government plays all of its mind games today. How Hitler told the masses that they were the victims in the situation, and that any acts of aggression, there were no other option. Just like us, where we are telling our citizens that if we're bombing a helpless nation, is because we are spreading democracy. Not in reality that we are taking out people that won't go along with our psychotic system and replacing them with someone who will play ball, someone who will go along, someone who won't ask questions. With the government understanding that they control the children at the times that our brains are still developing. Through many scientific studies, our brains do not finish developing until around age 25, or even if you went into university after going through 12 years of public schools, they hold you the whole time till your brain is finished. Telling you all of this should make you frustrated, should possibly make you angry at the system we are told to trust. But understand, knowledge is power, and all of this is freeing to where we understand that we hold all of the power. The only reason they want to keep us down and subservient and obedient is because we have all the power and they have none. They can only rule, they're only just to rule if they rule us just. They are no longer ruling us just if they ever did. It is about money and power to these people. And for us to understand that us together, we outnumber them. We outnumber them millions to one. So the more we educate ourselves, we unindoctrinate our children, we can begin to proceed with what should be the New World Order, what should be the Great Reset, without needing these people of power telling what's best for us. With the chemicals in our food, the chemicals in the sky, everything else they tell us, while we bicker amongst ourselves, thinking that race relations are worse than ever. The only reason race relations are worse than ever is because they tell us they are. So if we work together and understand we have more alike and more in common than we have differences, we could begin to live our best life, because I'm trying to do the same. Thank you.
Spin it again.
See you next time.